Welcome everyone to our fourth appointment in this spring seminar series at the Beyond Inhabitation Lab. My name is Michele Lancione and I'm the co-director of this lab together with Abdulmalik Simone. Today I'm extremely happy to have many friends in the room and also here in close to me to these chairs. Before we commence, I just want to say that I'm extremely happy to see so many people online and in person. And I would also like to say that I am so sorry not to see many other people that are not welcome in, I always get emotional, that are not welcome in these spaces. They are not welcome in these spaces because the university is in Europe, part and parcel of what we call Fortrex Europe. This department has worked with Frontex. It has worked with that industry of death that is constantly pushing people away. And we here today require for these people not to be here. The academy, in the ways in which it works in Europe and also in the United States, requires for some people not to be present, for some voices not to be heard. And I'm saying this not because I want to tick a cheap box, but I think that it is relevant for the talk that we are having today. We are having a talk not just for the sake of discussing about borders and discussing about the possibility of thinking beyond the institutional violence of sanctuary. We are having a talk because we need to redo the university. Yeah. So, many, sorry, I just got emotional because I saw my students.
Yeah.
So, you take this place and hopefully you'll make it better. Okay. Yeah, this safe size. Yes, okay. Everybody knows that in this room, every time you make you do a meeting, you have the comfort of this friend. It will just beep, and it will just allow for me to go back to my chair in peace. All right. I won't say anything else. Today's meeting is going to be chaired by a colleague and friend, Julia Cornier. Julia is doing a very important piece of research as part of her PhD here in Turin, looking at the extended carcerality within and beyond the detention centers, and is looking in particular at Barriera di Milano, as you know, here in Turin, very militarized and contested space. So I'm very happy that Julia accepted to introduce this meeting. So Julia, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this seminar. We are here today to discuss the book Beyond Sanctuary, the Humanism of a World in Motion, edited by Ananya, Veronika Zablotsky, with Leisy J, Abrego, Gaye Theresa Johnson, and Maite Zubiaurre. The book critically interrogates sanctuary and its place in Western humanism. The authors accompany migrant justice struggles and draw on the Black radical tradition, Indigenous studies, postcolonial theory, and critical refugee refugee studies. I think
it's on. It's on.
It's on? Yeah. Okay. The book was published last year in August by Duke University Press, and it was initiated during the first Trump presidency in order to understand and challenge unabashed attacks on sanctuary jurisdiction, many of them in liberal US cities. Now, with the return of Trumpism, such cities, notably Los Angeles, are under militarized occupation and lawless rule as the white nationalist regime seeks to make America white again. Beyond Sanctuary brings together scholars and artists to take up the questions of sanctuary not as a promise, but rather as a problem. Thinking across the United States and Europe, it examines how the liberal democracies of the West treat racial others through systems of deadly borders and elusive asylum. Instead of a demand for juridical protections of sanctuary or the comfort of hospitality, the work foregrounds the ideas and practices of these who are made fugitives and cast out into the world. The authors foreground these as migrant movements, intend the double meaning movement as motion and rebellion. Why Beyond Sanctuary comes into being at the moment of great crisis The authors situate such study and discussion in the long histories of colonialism and imperialism, thereby insisting that sanctuary must be taken up as a collective endeavor that is anti-colonial, abolitionist, and reparative. We are pleased to have here today with us Ananya and Veronika Zablotsky that will present the book. Ananya is Professor of Urban Planning, Social Welfare, and Geography at the Mayor Laskin at the University of California, where she holds the Mayor and Bernie Laskin Chair in Inequality and Democracy, which advances research and scholarship concerned with displacement and dispossession in Los Angeles and elsewhere in the world. Among their publications are City Requiem Calcutta, Gender and Politics of Poverty, Work in Cities, Asian Experiments and the Art of Being Global, Poverty Capital, Microfinance and Making of Development. Veronika Zablotsky is our postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Philosophy at the Prague University of Berlin. Her research focuses on political theory, postcolonial studies, feminist theory, and the history of political ideas. Among her co-edited publications are the anthologies Decolonize the City and Transforming Solidarities. After Ananya and Veronika introduction to the book, we are happy to have here with us Amin and Ida Danewid, who will respond to the book afterwards. Amin is Emeritus Professor of Geography at Fellows Christ College. He is known for his work in urban, cultural, and economic geography. Among his publications, we can enumerate Cities, Imagining the Urban, Land of Strangers, and After Nativism, Belonging in an Age of Intolerance. Ida Danewid is Associate Professor in Gender and Global Political Economy in the Department of International Relations at the University of Sussex, where she is the Director of the Center for Global Political Economy, as well as the University of Sussex. She published Resisting Racial Capitalism, an Anti-Political Theory of Refusal, and she co-edited the recently published special issue on South Atlantic Quarterly, titled Theorizing Racial Capitalism in Post-Imperial Europe. Following this discussion, we will move on with the Q&A with the audience. Thank you, and please join me in welcoming Ananya Roy and Veronika Zablotsky.
People at all see.
Okay. Perfect. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Can you hear me at the back? Yes? All right. Online as well. It's such a pleasure and honor to be here with Michele and Julia. Veronika and I would like to thank the Beyond Inhabitation Lab for hosting this event, and Amin and Ida Danewid for serving as discussants. And thank you also to the people joining us online, including Abdulmalik Simone. So at the UCLA Luskin Institute on Inequality and Democracy, and Michele, I just do hit this for advancing, yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
It's not advancing.
No, but
yeah, should be that one. Wait, because let's try it now. Page. What's not doing?
Maybe I'll do that.
It completely froze for some reason. Okay, now it works.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. So this book endeavor was housed at the UCLA Luskin Institute on Inequality and Democracy, a tiny, but we like to say a tiny but mighty research center, for which I've had the great privilege of serving as founding director for the last 10 plus years. And at the Institute, we accompany movements and communities on the front lines of dispossession and displacement, creating academic and public scholarship that challenges inequality and demands justice and liberation. We're deeply inspired by the work of the Beyond Inhabitation Lab, of Michele's tireless scholarship, of the work you all do, and of the anti-militarist organizing that bends our academic institutions towards justice. At the Institute, we usually start our convenings with a remembrance of stolen lives on stolen land. So this afternoon, I want to honor my comrade, Benito Flores, a key protagonist in a movement called Reclaiming Our Homes, which is a movement of unhoused people who, during the COVID-19 pandemic, started occupying state-hoarded vacant homes in El Sereno, an immigrant neighborhood in East Los Angeles. A welder by trade, Benito talked often about how he was lawfully homeless, relegated to that criminalized personhood through laws that kept wages low and rent high in Los Angeles. Last May, when the city served him an eviction notice from this reclaimed home, Benito penned an open letter to the LA County Sheriff urging him to become a conscientious objector, to refuse to carry out this unjust eviction of homeless elders, disabled people, and families with children. I read Benito's letter not as a petition for sanctuary. It was a demand. The demand was ignored. In a last stand against eviction from this reclaimed home, Benito built a treehouse on the property with the intent of barricading himself there when the sheriff's deputies arrived, including by chaining himself to the treehouse. But the self-made sanctuary turned deadly, and Benito fell to his death from the tree, and a neighbor discovered him one quiet morning. At the funeral and in the mural honoring Benito at the East Side Cafe, a cultural resistance space in Los Angeles inspired by the Zapatista movement, Benito has an opossum by his feet. Movement artists who created the mural explain that the opossum has the unusual ability to mimic death in order to evade predators. In a world of deathscapes, from death by design borders to death-dealing evictions, what forms of living are permitted for those cast out into the world? I start with Benito and the reclaimers because I wish to situate the figure of the border crosser, the asylum seeker, the refugee, in what Daniel Loic and Vanessa Thompson in a recent essay called Surplus Fascism. They argued that if we understand neo-fascism as, I quote, a complex intensification of racial capitalist conjunctures, then we can pay attention to how such authoritarianism targets surplus populations through, quote, deportation, criminalization, organized abandonment, or outright annihilation. I'm here with you today as my city, Los Angeles, continues to be under occupation by the Trump regime. ICE and Border Patrol agents abduct gardeners and street vendors and day laborers, enacting racial terror, a phrase I borrow from Paul Gilroy's book, The Black Atlantic. And they do so at places of ordinary urban life, at taco stands and car washes, at places of state protection such as schools and courtrooms. The US Supreme Court has legalized such racially discriminatory raids, where, in the words of Justice Sotomayor's dissent, quote, the government can seize anyone who looks Latino, speaks Spanish, and appears to work a low-wage job. With the LA 28 Olympics looming on the horizon and our universities all rallying for this big world event, Trump has created a security task force for the event, which he himself will head, promising containment camps for the homeless and other forms of urban securitization. Taking aim at the University of California, Los Angeles, the leading public university in the US, and my academic home, the Trump administration has canceled federal research grants and is demanding $1 billion through extortionary lawsuits. While the moment at hand might seem to be a fascist rupture, I see it as part of a long arc, one that Dylan Rodriguez has called white reconstruction. Quote, a historically persistent, continuous, and acute logic of racial colonial dominance. Liberal democracy is not the counterpoint to white reconstruction. It is entangled with it. So in the long shadow of racial fascism, Alberto Toscano thus shows how Black radical thinkers came to understand US fascism as originating from within the color lines of the liberal state and not just at its colonial frontiers. As Charles Mills reminds us, liberalism has always been racial liberalism. And it is here that I want to locate the question of sanctuary. As Julie mentioned, we initiated our work on sanctuary spaces in the days following Trump's first election, when he targeted sanctuary jurisdictions and enacted the infamous Muslim ban. The book was published during Trump's second presidential regime, as he sent federalized troops to Los Angeles and then to Portland, Chicago, Minneapolis, declaring that sanctuary policies were the driving cause of violence and chaos. Now, it's worth noting that such battles between the federal government and local jurisdictions are uncannily reminiscent of the era of US slavery, when the US Congress, through the Fugitive Slave Act, sought to empower slave owners and federal commissioners to hunt down suspected runaway slaves, even in states where slavery was illegal, and to penalize those obstructing such capture. So let me be clear then. Our interest in sanctuary is not a petition for the juridical protections of the liberal state. As the work of Naomi Pike has shown, while sanctuary policies in liberal US cities like Los Angeles extend legal protections to certain migrants, they exclude criminal aliens as well as those designated as potentially criminal. For example, those listed in gang databases, a notorious tool of racialized policing. So the limits of sanctuary lead us to this crucial question: what is the place of racial others in the liberal democracies of the West? Thinking across Europe and the US, in the book we argue that this place has been determined not only through deadly borders, but also through the terms of assimilation and humanitarian protection through which migrants are governed, be it the ruse of asylum or the conversion of migrants into cheap labor through deportability, analytical framings provided by Nick de Genova in the book. So this afternoon, let me share one set of reflections from and about the book, and it's about decolonization. So this is a book about the colonial relationalities that constitute the West, be it the stolen lands of the US or the Black Mediterranean that is Europe's death by design border. In rethinking sanctuary, we are in effect rethinking the West as the place of sanctuary. When Jacques Derrida, Europe's preeminent philosopher of cosmopolitanism, calls for European cities of refuge, he does so from the secure place that is Europe. In ongoing writings on humanitarian reason, Didier Frassine therefore argues that, I quote, the recognition of refugee status by European nations appears as an act of generosity towards a suffering stranger rather than the fulfillment of a political debt. In other words, the ruse of asylum is the ruse that is the West. What does it mean to plead sanctuary on the basis of recognized suffering? Who has the power to grant such recognition? The power of recognition and reconciliation, as Ida Danewid argues, lies with white innocence, a term that Gloria Wecker has mobilized to explain the structured denial of racial colonial violence. The Black Mediterranean Collective, which includes Danewid, instead asks us to, and I'm quoting Ida and comrades here, to place the contemporary migrant crisis in the context of Europe's constitutive history of empire, colonial conquest, and transatlantic slavery. They ask us to think of the Black Mediterranean not just as Europe's graveyard, but rather, quote, as a powerful ethico-political demand. This ethico-political demand is precisely what the US sanctuary movements of the 1980s were about. As US Cold War intervention in Central America fueled mass migration, and as these refugees were systematically denied asylum in the US, activists demanded sanctuary protections. So in 1989, responding to grassroots pressure, San Francisco passed the City of Refuge Ordinance that framed sanctuary policies not as humanitarian protection, but as an act of reparation for imperialism. The ordinance read, I quote, "The people of the United States owe a particular responsibility to political refugees from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras because of the role that the United States military and other war-related aid has played in prolonging the political conflict in those countries." These sanctuary policies have been steadily weakened through the punitive exceptions I earlier mentioned. So there are other radical ways of thinking about sanctuary in the US. So one of these comes from Indigenous scholars. In one of the films accompanying our Sanctuary Spaces project and the Beyond Sanctuary book, Veronika Zablotsky, whom you will hear from in just a few minutes, interviews Melanie Yalty, who's co-founder of the Red Nation. And Yalty recounts how Indigenous organizers protested the Muslim ban through welcoming ceremonies at US airports, including the Los Angeles International Airport. Yalty described the intervention as one that asserts Indigenous legal and political orders of belonging, and that disrupts the US settler colonial narrative, particularly of America as a nation of immigrants. Such Indigenous sovereignty and sanctuary, Yalty notes, predates the United States, and then with this full-throated laugh, and it's a laugh I can never get out of my head, Yalty adds that these forms of Indigenous belonging and sanctuary will continue to exist well after the United States is gone. In various chapters of the book, our authors talk about the infrastructures of sanctuary and decolonial solidarity that far exceed the nation state and that far exceed the temporality of the nation state. This is at the very heart of what in the book we call migrant movements. Again, as Julia pointed out, we intend migrant movement as a double meaning. On the one hand, it is the forced mobility of those cast out into the world. On the other hand, migrant movements are global histories of revolt, of fugitivity, of marronage, of what Sharachari in the book calls oceanic archives of struggle, what Vanessa Thompson in the book calls the resistance of surplus people. In the US, there's a long history of such infrastructures of decolonial solidarity. So the Fugitive Slave Act I mentioned earlier were met with the extraordinary organizing that was the Underground Railroad, offering safe passage to fugitive slaves. My own partner's family fled El Salvador in the 1980s and sought asylum in the United States. Relegated to low-wage jobs, his mother and his aunts took up cleaning homes, often 7 days a week. They would travel from East Los Angeles by bus to the mansions of Malibu. And they tell the story of La Migra stopping and boarding these buses, turning the buses into detention and deportation centers. And they tell the story of the bus drivers who would speed up and who would simply drive past immigration enforcement agents, refusing to stop, thereby turning their buses, if for a moment, into fugitive sanctuaries. Such fugitive sanctuaries are being created and practiced every day in US cities and communities. These are networks of monitoring and warning that trail the unmarked cars of federal agents, that create clamorous soundscapes of car honks, megaphones, and whistles as community communication. These are systems of revolutionary care that bring food to the homes of those who cannot safely venture out to jobs or grocery stores, and that escort their children to school. This and so much more. These are, to borrow a framing from Amin, a relational politics of belonging. So in closing, I'm going to share with you one glimpse of these infrastructures via Anthony Orendorff's love letter to Los Angeles. It's a short video. Anthony is a researcher at the Institute and was arrested and held by the Los Angeles police for several days for the act of documenting an ICE raid in his neighborhood. As you watch Anthony's moving video, I want you to keep in mind that I am not positing that such migrant movements are the grassroots resistance to global structures of oppression. This is not the local versus the global. This is not the community versus the police state. Rather, following my dear comrade and brilliant historian, Robin D.G. Kelley, I understand this as reconstruction, as the unfinished work of decolonization, abolition, and freedom. Writing over a century ago, particularly about the movement of the dark proletariat, of fugitive slaves, W.E.B. Du Bois called this abolition democracy. Robin D.G. Kelley, writing in Insurgent Ground, Land, Housing and Property, an edited volume that comes out of one of the freedom schools recently hosted by the Institute, argues that it's not enough to mitigate these inhumane conditions. The third reconstruction must be anti-capitalist and decolonial. It means no more cages, no more carceral shelters, banishment, or evictions. He adds, it should not expect the state to back our demands. Sanctuary, then, is not a petition or a promise. It is not even a demand. Because the antonym of racial banishment isn't sanctuary. The antonym of racial banishment is abolition. So, Michele, if we could show Anthony's video.
Sure. Just a second, everyone. I'm gonna unshare this screen. Okay.
What's going on?
I will share it with everyone at home now. Okay.
I'm in the city of angels, and this is the world that is happening.
Let me begin with
I love my city, not for its overpriced rent, not for the fake stars on Hollywood Boulevard. I love LA for the people that helped raise me, the people at the taco stand that feeds me and my whole family for under $20, the people at the Santee Alley who sold me affordable jeans and made me my favorite Tupac shirt so I can be fresh on my first day of 8th grade, the flower vendors, always kind, always there when I needed to buy flowers to say thank you to my mom for raising me and my sister, the day laborers outside Home Depot who shared their heart to a kid with a flip camera so I can begin my journey as a storyteller. These people aren't just my neighbors. They are threads woven into the fabric that makes this city what it is. But they also made me. And now they are disappearing because masked men who are not from our neighborhoods are abducting them, separating them from their families and our community. So LA took to the streets. And if you never had a loved one ripped from your arms, or have never had people you know at risk of being taken, it might be difficult to understand why someone might throw a rock or anything they can find to stop them from being taken. But we won't get into that, because that's not even the biggest threat to this government. What this government fears more than a flying plastic water bottle or a burning car is our relentless sacrifice and commitment we give to each other to fight for a better life. A vital lesson we inherited from the very people at risk of being kidnapped right now. They have shown us what it means to struggle, what it means to endure, and what it means to take care of each other. And as the media and politicians will focus on looting and a narrative that the people are violent, what is actually happening right now is a new world being born. A system rooted in care and resistance, where people have built networks to alert each other when an ICE raid is happening, where people are standing up to federal agents and kicking them out of their neighborhoods, where people are patrolling their blocks, where people are protecting the vulnerable targets of abduction, where people are buying groceries for people who are too scared to go outside, where high school kids show up every day to the building that holds their families and their friends' families hostage, where people dance, sing, and fight back any way they can, where people take hits from the people who are paid to protect us, where people give each other free Medicare. It's clear that the only thing these federal agents know how to do is take. But our city will forever know how to give. And that will always be our way and how we win, even when it seems like we are losing everything. Thank you, LA.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. I will ask Veronika to come forward so we can continue. I'm going to share the screen again for everyone at home.
So how do I advance?
Yes, that's right. So I think I did the same thing before. Sorry, the computer is tired. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I might be using the microphone. So it's wonderful to be here with you. Is it on?
Yeah.
You can hear me in the back like this? Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So it's wonderful to be here with you in Turin and to follow on Ananya Roy, who is such a brilliant speaker and collaborator, and it's my honor. I also would like to thank you, Michele, for having us, and to everyone who was involved in organizing this event, of course, to Julia, thank you, and to all of you who are here, especially Ida, Danewid, and Amin for taking the time to engage in conversation with us. Greatly look forward to that. So my name is Veronika Zablotsky, and I'm a political theorist based in Berlin at Freie Universität Berlin, where for the past few years, I was part of a research project on transformative solidarity practices in labor, housing, and health in Berlin. And previously, prior to that, I was working with Ananya at UCLA as a postdoctoral researcher as part of the Sanctuary Spaces seminar that led up to the Beyond Sanctuary anthology, which I co-edited. For many years now, I have accompanied anti-racist and migrant justice organizing across Europe, West Asia, and North America. And for the past 5 years or so of that, I have been working closely with the transnational sanctuary movement, specifically in Berlin and wider Germany. This has resulted in a research partnership that entailed oral history interviews with practitioners and migrants who were involved in the first cases of specifically church asylum in the 1980s in Germany, and who since then have shaped the contemporary practice of sanctuary on church premises to protect asylum seekers at risk of deportation across Europe and North America. What I found, and that is the subject of my current or next book project, if you will, is that the now rather predominant theological or humanitarian framings of church asylum as a sanctuary practice have been elaborated after the fact, largely in response to the criminalization of the practice and its advocates. In living memory and informal movement archives, sanctuary as church asylum, despite its faith-based aspects, remains rooted in radical histories of anti-fascism, anti-imperialism, and anti-colonial solidarities right here in Europe. When churches and synagogues across the southwestern United States began to practice sanctuary also in the early 1980s, so almost simultaneously the practice emerged on both sides of the Atlantic, its proponents conceived of sanctuary as a necessary consequence of US imperialism in Central America. Building on legacies of historical abolitionism, such as the Underground Railroad, which Ananya has also just mentioned, sanctuary congregations sought to build platforms for public truth-telling by displaced Salvadoran, Guatemalan, and Honduran human rights defenders as agents of social and ethical transformation in the global north. This is well documented, for example, in the book that is featured here on the right, titled Sanctuary, the New Underground Railroad. This required active listening and unlearning on the part of sanctuary practitioners, not as hosts, but as partners in a project of planetary decolonization, as well as principled legal defense. At the sanctuary trials of the 1980s, as described by Susan Coutin, who was a legal observer at the time and wrote about them, defendants claimed to uphold just laws that the US government was ignoring. They described sanctuary as civil initiative to bring about a kind of justice to come, amidst racist debates that continue to criminalize the very act of seeking asylum or moving, along with solidarity efforts to facilitate safe passage and the right to remain for people on the move. Both in Europe and North America, the meaning of sanctuary has long expanded to secular jurisdictions of non-cooperation with immigration authorities and expanded social services at the level of cities and municipalities, as far afield as San Francisco, Sheffield, and Naples. Cities across Europe have adopted sanctuary measures to protect undocumented migrants from arrest or deportation, for example, by issuing city IDs, and there are many other projects that you can see here on this interactive map, which showcases best practice models across Europe to try and inspire others for what could be done. While much of this here that you can maybe look into later if you're interested, was prompted by the so-called summer of migration of 2015, and we are now in a very different, exceedingly fascist conjuncture. The structural violence of European and North American border regimes continues long-standing colonial legacies and neo-colonial patterns. The production of surplus populations on the move, their calculated exposure to premature death, and the ongoing process of border externalization are not only lethal, but also big business for corporations such as Palantir, but also universities that, as Michele's work and the work of others has shown, get paid to develop ever more fine-tuned maps or surveillance technologies for border enforcement agencies or border police, such as Frontex or in the US CBP and ICE, to detain and warehouse migrants, to harvest their biometric data and carry out deportation flights. At the same time, so-called safe third countries are contracted and paid off by EU member states and the US to serve as so-called return hubs, in a very cynical, kind of euphemistic naming of deportation regimes for deportable migrants, irrespective of status or country of origin. Or these countries are paid off to carry out illegal pushbacks, such as in the case of Libya, producing ever-growing numbers of death by design. With the coming reforms of the common European asylum system, which will go into effect in less than a month, or a little over a month and a half, in June of this year, migrant detention and deportation regimes in Europe will scale up in ways that sanctuary as shelter, in this kind of limited sense of sanctuary as shelter, cannot meaningfully challenge. So I would love to discuss with you how we make sense of those coming changes. Thus, Beyond Sanctuary, the anthology, is dedicated to fugitivities and mobilities beyond recognition that unsettle the grounds of dispossession and disrupt neo-colonial border regimes. For this endeavor, we drew on intellectual traditions that demand a rethinking, not just of humanitarianism, but also of humanism itself. The Black radical tradition, Indigenous studies, postcolonial thought, and critical refugee studies, to think from the West otherwise, and also to think the West otherwise, through the Black Revolt, Oceanic Strikes, migrant squats, and cross-border solidarity initiatives that we study and accompany in the book and beyond. As noted by Sunaina Mayra, and I quote, "Abolitionist sanctuary links border violence to carcerality, neoliberal capitalism, white supremacy, settler colonialism, and fascism." Chapters in our book situate Black fugitive sanctuary and centers Black fugitive sanctuary in histories of Black fugitive sanctuaries within landscapes of pan-Indigenous resistance to removal, enclosure, and dispossession that constitute the anti-colonial genealogies of practical abolition. By reinscribing the United States through the modality of stolen land and Europe through the modality of the Black Mediterranean, Beyond Sanctuary brings together critiques of racial capitalism and settler colonialism through the lens of sanctuary as the disruptive hospitality politics of Black and Indigenous fugitives that escape and resist regimes of dispossession and move towards alternatives. Though this is a freedom beyond humanism, as Rinaldo Walcott argues in his chapter in our book, it is rooted in a humanism made to the measure of the world. To put it with Césaire of Fanon, a planetary humanism, to borrow a term from Paul Gilroy, and as one that remains embattled. This core concern of Beyond Sanctuary explains the subtitle for our book, The Humanism of a World in Motion, which foregrounds alternative relationalities of solidarity that expand the liberatory meaning of the human as a fraught category. In this, we were also guided by Sylvia Wynter's instructive work, of course, on the human after man, with capital M, man, being the hegemonic white property-owning figure of Western humanism. We were also guided by the work of Charles Sepulveda, an Achiachemen and Tongva scholar who, in his chapter in our book, titled Beyond the Social Death of Conquest, develops the concept of kuyam as a decolonial, and I quote Sepulveda, as a decolonial possibility of hospitality on indigenous terms and land. Kuyam, the word for guests in the language of the Tongva, whose homeland, Tavangar, is also known as Los Angeles, offers a radical re-envisioning of relations to place beyond the logic of conquest that moves beyond the native settler binary to begin making and maintaining reciprocal kinship and kinships in the plural, previously alienated by conquest, slavery, and its afterlife in the Americas and at the global scale of racial capitalism. Because, quote, and I quote Ruth Wilson Gilmore here, freedom is not simply the absence of enslavement as a legal and property form, end quote. Sanctuary as abolition, as Ananya just reminded us, is a world-making activity that creates room for people to make abolition geographies from what they have. And that's again, of course, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who also reminds us, quote, that unfinished liberation is the still to be achieved work of abolition. Freedom is a place and does not simply exist, but it must be cultivated through relations of reciprocity and solidarity, including across hemispheres. Under conditions of fugitivity, collective dreaming of freedom, as for example, S.A. Smythe elaborates in their pivotal chapter, Black Mediterranean Freedom Dreams in her book, is a rehearsal for life, another important concept of Gilmore's, who conceives of the Black radical tradition as the, quote, evolving accumulation of structures of feeling, whose individual and collective narrative arcs persistently tend towards freedom as something to be actualized, not simply there. Vanessa Thompson, in her chapter on the international pathways of abolition, connecting Minneapolis to Dessau and Moria to Tripoli, reminds us that abolition is also a feminist project by pointing, to amongst other reasons, to the gendered conditions of labor within abolitionist organizing, which must be redistributed rather than merely romanticized. I want to end my talk by returning to my city of Berlin. And before I do so, I think the slides got mixed up, so I'll return to this one later. I want to turn to the city of Berlin, where self-organized refugee and migrant justice movements, as also, of course, elsewhere across Europe and North America, have built significant transnational platforms and visibility since at least the 1990s, long shifting from bids for legalization and citizenship rights to frameworks of decolonization and abolition, to dismantle the border regime as a whole, demand an end to detention in general and in particular in camps, an end to structural racism and violence against women and queers, and struggling to achieve freedom of movement for all, along with adequate housing, healthcare, and political participation rights. So when Angela Davis visited an occupied former school in Berlin that was transformed into the so-called refugee strike house by the refugee strike movement in Germany, she stated that the refugee movement is the movement of the 21st century. She has since repeated this many times, for example, when she came back and was invited for another visit by the feminist activist group International Women's Space in 2022. So here you still see a still from a video from that solidarity visit of a talk that, or a speech that Angela Davis gave on a square called Oranienplatz in Berlin-Kreuzberg, which is where the original occupation took place in 2014, 2015. In winter 2014, when it was snowing, it got to sub-zero temperatures. People moved to that occupied school, and that was held for another year, catalyzing a lot of campaigning and organizing around Berlin and beyond. Self-organized groups such as International Women's Space, which I just mentioned, emerged out of the public square occupations, hunger strikes, and squatting actions of the refugee strike movement in Germany and beyond. To cite Celine Berry, a colleague of mine from Berlin, their interventions, quote, expose the colonial causes of flight and migration across the global south, as well as the gender dimension of these processes, in theory and in practice. Through mutual aid and collective care, so Berry, refugee-led, feminist, anti-capitalist, and anti-racist organizing practices actualize a kind of, and that's Berry's term, Ubuntu humanism, as a universalist humanist principle that fosters, quote, connection between people in the face of divisive, oppressive forms of socialization under colonial capitalism, end quote. And here you see Jennifer Kamau, one of the founders of International Women's Space, present their important political work and demands in conversation with Celine Berry at a conference we organized in Berlin in 2023. As refugee activists engage in solidarity action across difference, they decidedly reject any form of paternalism, co-optation, and exploitation. Allyship and accompaniment, of course, are effortful practices that require a commitment to listening, self-reflexivity, and open-ended transformation. Despite many setbacks and structural obstacles to this, solidarity action campaigns such as Abolish Frontex exemplify the kind of internationalism that is needed to push back against the expanding carceral geographies of EU and US border regimes. As scholars in solidarity, it is upon us to center movement-based knowledges in non-extractive and self-reflective ways from a position of co-resistance, if you will, as argued by the abolitionist anthropologist Laurel Masing, and to engage contradictions when our institutional homes are complicit in reproducing or producing the structural violence that we oppose. It is precisely migrant movements, in the sense that we outline in the book, that respond to the ethical political demand of a world in motion. And for that, we're in conversation with Ida Danewid's work and the work of others, by practically reinventing what is narrated and consolidated under the sign of the West today. This is what Ananya has conceptualized so importantly as reworlding the West. And this is about building transformative sanctuary beyond the humanism of the West to advance something different, an anti-colonial humanism to come, to be made, and to advance the ongoing planetary liberation struggles that are as of yet unfinished. And I will go back to the slide just to mention that the book, Beyond Sanctuary, is accompanied by an extensive archive of online resources and digital materials that we composed in 2020, 2021, during the pandemic, when our conversations had to move in the virtual sphere and now are available for classroom discussion or self-guided study in engaging with the materials in the book, which is available open access. So if you actually scan this QR code, that will take you to the site of Duke University Press, and you can download individual chapters, so the entire book. We really want for it to circulate widely and to be read not only in the university, but also much beyond, not as kind of the end of a conversation, but rather as the beginning and an opening that we are inviting you to join. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Veronika. I will now invite here Amin and Ida Danewid. So Ash, maybe you can start, and Ida, after Ash, you can. So Ash and Ida will provide commentary, and then you will have the chance to respond, and we will open up. White pollution.
Thank you, Michele. Thank you, Michele. Hard to know what to say after these two really stimulating talks and such an amazing book. And I'm going to concentrate on the book, obviously, because this is what I was asked to do. And in a sense, it's nothing but praise, but I want to close with a few slightly awkward questions for the sake of discussion. So, Beyond Sanctuary offers I wrote excoriating, but I think it's merciless. It's a merciless critique of the humanist or humanitarian liberal precept and politics of sanctuary, arguing that the logic of safe spaces for migrants and that of expulsion stem from the same roots. And this is the roots of, we've heard already, of racial capitalism. First, dispossessing, disposing, deracinating, and denigrating those on the move, and then liberalism enacting a territorial politics of the anomalous outsider. The book's body of concepts, words, and situations is nothing but arresting. It's one that exposes the hypocrisies of humanitarian reason, which locates allocated power in the metropole, while conveniently forgetting its role in robbing and displacing colonized peoples in the first place. It's a humanism, a humanitarianism. The distinction is fine, but it's sometimes you can elide it. You do in the book, I think. That makes the claims of the dispossessed, indigenous, black, expelled, secondary to the priorities of the white settler nation that treats these subjects as foreign bodies in the first place to be punished or to be permitted. Both nativism and liberalism come off badly in the book. The former for its brutal treatment of the imagined stranger, and the latter for its moral piety or concessionary logic. The book, we've heard already, makes a really important contribution to decolonial and anti-capitalist writing, this time upending the very notion of sanctuary by questioning the legitimacy of the giving or taking metropolis. It turns its protagonists, indigenous people, black people, migrants, into rightful heirs, H-E-I-R-S, if this is the right term, rather than supplicants, but without pretense of any expectations on the bio or geopolitical horizons. Instead, its thinking, correctly in my view, turns to blackness, the ways in which the denied in expulsion think, feel, and act autonomously to foreshadow another much more affirmative relation to others and to place. The essays capped by Ananya and Veronika's powerful introduction reject the thieving territorial biopolitics of racial capitalism by foregrounding the world-making practices in carceral fugitivity. A great virtue for the collection, for me at least, which by the way is curated as a single voice. I mean, well done. This is really quite terrific to do this with an edited book. The great virtue of the collection is the detail it provides on these practices. Often enough, we don't have detail on fugitive practices, which are named through a rich lexicon on embodied knowing, anterior history, wayward artistry, mutual kinship, and fugitive learning, which all speak to a kind of earthly rather than territorial dwelling. We see the signposts of another existential geography that could be seeded by a reciprocity between critical scholarship and wayfarer wisdom. University classes in our Frontex age spreading abolitionist thought, but also, as Loja Garcia Pena writes in the book, radical hope in suffocation, aligned with old ways of Black dreaming, Black freedom schools, indigenous principles of Kuyam, or indeed also a precept of guest occupancy of land and not ownership of land. And of course, another memorable phrase, life in unbreathing, and rehearsal shared by Atlantic Black, Indigenous, and migrant subjects. And gradually in the book, the discourse of sanctuary is displaced by the homilies of queer kinship among and between the diverse outcasts of racial and colonial capitalism. These are the homilies of Montaz, and Marinage, which then are there foregrounded because they bind Black fugitivity, feminist care, and migrant solidarity in diverse conditions of bridge. So kind of translateralism is slowly unfolding in this book, where the different struggles are referenced with each other, which is a really important step, I think. So the geography of a very different relationship to the earth is traced by the book, a much more capacious alternative to border biopolitics, including an oceanic internationalism acknowledging life and wreckage in the sea itself. So everything counts, everything has to be made visible, and everything has to be considered, and which then slowly recasts sanctuary as a planetary right, Sharad Chari, that you mentioned in your opening remarks. The book is a rare example of radical critique plus directionality, very much echoing Michele's own book on home. So I have nothing but admiration for the book, but do want to probe into one, for me, quite significant question, political question, which is, what are the chances of queer geography in our violently xenophobic conjuncture? A question that raises quite awkward questions of coalition and also public assent. I share your argument for the need to completely rethink sanctuary. You couldn't have done better. And to do so as a politics of slow cultural burn, linking up the countless forms of resistance you cite. Abolish Frontex and Gilets Noirs are the two interesting examples of coalition with para-institutional force that you quote, and of course you've given many more examples in your two talks today. But what about alliances with other discontents of punitive biopolitics, still wedded to, dare I say, border thinking? How far are you willing to work out of political necessity with liberal and moral causes for sanctuary, knowing that millions of forced migrants, often enough, are desperate for the right to enter and to settle? Are you open to demands for a just migration system that nonetheless stops short of open borders? I ask these questions because our cruel moment may require a broader public-facing narrative of freedom. In the book, I found that you were sometimes ambivalent about Paul Gilroy's attempt to wrest humanism out of its European version, which always buries the history of colonial violence. If blackness undoes the universalism peddled by Euro-American humanism, as Fanon admonished Sartre for, and as Ronaldo Walcott reiterates in your book, are the arguments of post-racial humanism also invalidated? In our toxic and murderous moment, around such a humanism could emerge common political momentum beyond humanitarian reason. Walcott asks in his chapter how we may live differently together, but then I think he goes on to reject humanism as a signifier of freedom, but he doesn't offer an alternative. And you might argue there is no alternative. We should not be thinking in terms of alternatives. I'd quite like to wrestle with an alternative. And could one non-Europeanist signifier be that of, and it's in your book, of stifled breath? The humanness of all living as good ancestors and good guests, because that's all that being at the edge of the abyss affords today, regardless of status and location. I personally have no particular commitment to humanism, but I am interested in how to name togetherness in ways that might carry, my earlier comments about building coalitions and securing public assent. Part of this carrying in our internecine moment may be about having very uneasy bedfellows. I'm troubled by the power asymmetry between queer kinship and the politics of recognition, especially so because the legacy of radical internationalism, which aligned territory to decolonization, from transnationalism and Bandung to coastal lawyering and Pan-Africanism, has frayed. I should clarify that my questions here that I pose are very much about the terms of entry and settlement for migrants, rather than about the ground of Indigenous and Black struggles, where your arguments on abolition politics, joint action, fugitivity, in shared kinship are exactly right, in my view. And here, as one of your authors, Loja Pena, writes, abolition is sanctuary, because there is already some relation to the land. But in the case of the millions and now almost billion migrants on the move, there is no relation to land. That relation to land has been removed. So in our world of territorial sovereign power, the scepter of landing rights, whatever the status of sanctuary talk, in my view, looms very large. in anti-colonial struggles, abolition has always included the demand for territory and sovereignty, to push out extractive white power, sometimes with some consideration of what kind of relation to hold with the land after the whites have been kicked out. Migrant claims for sanctuary are not so far from this demand, potentially, albeit without abolition pretenses, often in desperation, aligned with humanitarians campaigning for fairer and just migration rules. So, is there no coalition to be struck here, despite the liberal conceits of personhood, in mounting an anti-nativist politics of recognition? And even if not, what are we to make of the Fanon of blackness refusing to give up on the quest for nation and nationhood? What does this struggle mean for the billions on the move today, confronted by cruel border regimes? Is home for them to be only fugitive occupancy, usually in hapless places, short of territory? I guess this is the central question for me, whether sanctuary, your version of sanctuary, can include territory in fuller ways than land as a guest right, as proposed in your truly stimulating and quite extraordinary book. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, first, Michaela and Julia, for organizing this and for bringing us together. And thank you so much to Ananya and to Veronika for this very, very powerful presentation. I want to start by saying, right, that this is an enormously generative and I think it's also a very timely volume that brings together contributors from a range of different fields and disciplines to really explore the limits of liberal genres of sanctuary and humanism. Yes. Okay. So as Ananya and Veronika write in the opening chapter, sanctuary is the West's promise to include and to protect racial others. Well, it is a promise, right, which kind of presents itself in the language of aid, care, and humanitarianism. It ultimately perpetuates containment, surveillance, separation, and carceral violence. As they go on to show in the introduction, right, we can find in the Western tradition of social and political thought at least two different genealogies of this, right? And the first one that they point to is sanctuary as a religious and as a specifically Christian philosophy, right, which is based on offering protected and sacred safety to those who are in need. The second tradition is associated with Jacques Derrida's ethics of hospitality in its relation to what he calls cities of refuge. So Derrida was writing in the 1990s, and he was very much responding to the tightening of border regimes within Europe at that point in time. And he was also thinking about the tension between Europe's rhetoric of universal human rights and its de facto very restrictive border policies. So this idea of cities of refuge is effectively for Derrida a way to hold Europe accountable to its own Enlightenment ideals. I think we see another instance of this in the statement that Derrida released together with Jürgen Habermas in 2003, condemning the war in Iraq and calling on Europe to act as a kind of counterweight to the US. Again, Derrida here is attempting to forge a shared European identity through its commitment to human rights, democracy, and international law. Again, calling very much on Europe to live up to its own cosmopolitan ideals. But of course, as the book shows, right, there are many problems with both of these ways of thinking about sanctuary. At best, they offer a kind of band-aid and a momentary sense of relief. And at worst, they actively support, legitimize, and naturalize state power, including the global form of apartheid that states uphold through their borders and their immigration controls. Crucially, frameworks like Derrida's, which actively positions Europe as being the ethical subject and the savior of the world, of course, as we've heard today already, relies on a colonial amnesia which erases Europe's own history of enslavement, occupation, expropriation, and dispossession. And so only by abstracting away from Europe's own colonial violence, and the fact, of course, that today the majority of migrants that are attempting to come to Europe, right, are coming from places that previously were under European control. Only through that act of erasure can Europe remain the center of moral authority. So my own work, and as Ananya mentioned before, right, I've sought to problematize this through focus on the Black Mediterranean and very much in engagement with Gloria Becker's work on white innocence. So this effectively, right, is a humanitarian logic that turns questions which I think are, or at the very least, they ought to be about border abolition, right? They ought to be about reparations and decolonization. And instead, they end up being about questions of pity, charity, of helping so-called strangers, and so on and so forth. I think the limits of this cosmopolitan framework, right, and its forms of hospitality and sanctuary becomes glaringly obvious when we consider Jürgen Habermas's silence, right, on the genocide in Gaza, and his continued insistence that Israel has a right to self-defense, really no matter what. Here, Europe's own responsibility in fueling the genocide through arms sales, right, aid and research, that doesn't just disappear from view, but instead it's actively presented as moral righteousness. Here, I think that Paul Gilroy's distinction between what he calls a politics of fulfillment and one of transfiguration might be helpful in order to pinpoint what is wrong with liberal forms of sanctuary. So in the Black Atlantic, Gilroy argues that a politics of fulfillment is one that plays itself out within the limits of the given hegemonic order. It is based, he writes, on the notion that a future society will be able to realize the social and the political promise the present society has left unaccomplished. In essence, a politics of fulfillment, he writes, demands that bourgeois civil society live up to the promises of its own rhetoric, right? This is very much Derrida's project of sanctuary. But Gilroy then contrasts that with what he calls a politics of transfiguration, which he says strives in pursuit of the sublime, struggling to repeat the unrepeatable to present the unpresentable, calling for the emergence of qualitatively different desires, social relations, and modes of association. And so in simple terms, where the politics of fulfillment seeks to make the existing order more humane, it ultimately does not challenge its architecture of power, or the terror and the dispossession in which it is built. As Harney and Moten write in the Undercommons, the enslaved didn't seek the reform, but the elimination of the plantation. So in the face, right, of such forms of protection and of humanitarianism that remain underwritten by racialized terror and expropriation, what might sanctuary be, right? Or what might it become when we turn away from international law and human rights and towards practices of abolition, decolonization, and refusal? One of the things that I appreciated the most about the book is precisely that it takes this question so seriously. As Ananya and Veronika write, we seek to shift the question of sanctuary from the recognition of suffering to fugitivity and mobility, in response to this ethical political demand of a world in motion. They do this in dialogue with the Black radical tradition, with Indigenous studies and anti-colonial thought, and by attempting to expand the capacity for liberatory meanings and practices of sanctuary. As part of that, they also give us a rich archive of revolt, from cross-border solidarity action networks to migrant strikes and struggles for housing, an archive that ultimately encourages us to ask not so much what is the role of human rights or of international law and of sanctuary in transforming the world, but rather what might it mean to refuse the terms of law, of racial capital, and of the state altogether. What can we learn from other genres of resistance and from freedom struggles that don't take the law or the state as their object or their horizon, but that operate for extra and perhaps even for illegal registers, be it for fugitivity and disobedience or for unruliness and refusal, and that manifest as riot, as rebellion, and as insurrection? And so with that in mind, I have 3 questions that I thought might be interesting for us to discuss. And some of this echoes what Ash has already pointed towards. But I too wanted to begin with the question of humanism, because as the book points out, right, what is at stake here is not just a question of how we think sanctuary or solidarity or protection otherwise, but it's also very much a question of humanism. And so here the book calls for a reworlding and a re-enchantment, right, of humanism, right, and very much so in the spirit of Sylvia Wynter. But while I'm very sympathetic to that, there's a part of me that also wonders if such a reworlding is possible without smuggling Europe back in through the back door, right? So do we, again, right, Ash raised this point already, but do we need to hold on to humanism? Or might there be other registers of freedom and of liberation that's perhaps even serve us better in our ongoing struggles? Second, I also wanted to ask about domicide, which the book theorizes as the systematic and the deliberate mass destruction of homes, and which I think is just such an incredibly useful concept. But in centering questions around fugitivity and mobility and of the ethical political demand of a world in motion, how and where might we also make space to think about practices of resisting domicide, right, of staying put and of refusing to move, right, what Palestinians have taught us to think of as sumud. That is, where is the space within this alternative effort political demand to refuse a world of forced mobility, of displacement and of dispossession, in which some people's homes are built literally on the ruins of other people's houses? So obviously, right, I asked this question very much in the context of the genocide in Gaza and the bombing of Iran. But I'm also mindful, right, of settler colonial practices throughout the world, right, including in Sweden, which is where I grew up, where indigenous Sami people are under constant threat of displacement and dispossession due to the mining and the logging industries, and increasingly also from the green energy transition. So how might you then think homefulness or the right to domus and the importance of sumud, right, alongside these fugitive forms of sanctuary? And then finally, and to connect to what Michele already alluded to at the start of our session, right, I wanted to ask about what, if any, might be the role of the university, right, in this alternative, fugitive and commoning form of sanctuary. So in the UK, which is where I'm based, right, there are now a range of so-called sanctuary universities, right, that take inspiration from this idea of sanctuary cities, and they claim to welcome refugees and to foster a culture of hospitality. But of course, in reality, many of these universities collaborate actively with the Home Office, right, and also with the police. They also hold significant investments in the arms industry and fossil fuel industries. But also in companies, right, that are very much so complicit in the genocide in Gaza. As a recent report by the Transnational Institute shows, on which Michele offered forward to, right, universities also play an indispensable role in the development, the perpetuation, and very much of the expansion of Fortress Europe. So this ranges from supplying analysis, surveillance, and technologies to even training, right, Frontex border guards. So where then does that leave the university, and especially the so-called sanctuary university? And what does all of this mean, right, for those of us who study, right, learn, and come together and work in the university? So yeah, that's essentially it. But thank you for writing such a wonderful, really grateful.
Ananya and Veronika, would you like to come back here?
I feel we should have Ash and Ida here too, but do you want to take questions?
Do you want to? You can offer a response to these comments, or we can take more questions. Maybe.
Okay, but maybe we start with the response.
First, and then we.
Sure. Do you want to go first, or do you want to?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
But are they going to join us? Are Ash and Ida going to join us?
No, I think we.
No.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Ash and Ida, for your comments, reflections, helpful questions, and also interventions. I tried to frantically kind of take notes and jot down a lot of thoughts that they sparked, and I'm sure to miss some aspects that I hope Ananya will then kind of remind us or just pick up. And I will try to respond perhaps to both sets of questions in one go, because both of you, of course, rightfully kind of push on our kind of decision to remain beholden to the project of forging a kind of anti-colonial humanism, despite the well-rehearsed and important and legitimate critiques of such a project. And we didn't make that decision lightly. We actually were in close conversation with critics, for example, in the last quarter of our of a Sawyer seminar, which produced all of these online conversations. We hosted a large convening with Saidia Hartman as a keynote speaker, in conversation with Tina Kampt and others. And I think in that convening, there was a somewhat consensus that emerged around dispensing with the category of the human for all of its baggage, for the fact that it risks, basically, as you put it, smuggling Europe back through the back door. And of course, there might be other categories that could have kind of a more emancipatory kind of pull, and there might be good reasons for that. I'm thinking just off the cuff of something that I think can be described as the more than human kind of hyphenated kind of formations that attempt to situate humanity within its relations with non-human agents, environments, and so on. So the kind of new materialism conversation, which is not necessarily where we took the book, but it would have been, I think, a very welcome conversation that could have emerged. And yet, in that insistence politically on holding the human to account, so to speak. For example, one way that I think of this is the way that Trouillot, in Silencing the Past, thinks of the Haitian Revolution as the possibility of a truly universalist kind of insurgent humanity that, as he puts it, thought itself out in practice. So something that would have not been conceivable within the kind of parameters of the Western humanist kind of conversation that was consolidating around a kind of colonial hierarchy and divisions, and yet disrupted that, and in practice actualized an alternative possibility that remains unfinished. And this is, I think, the anti-colonial genealogy of a planetary humanism that we are kind of agonizing with or struggling over, and that remains unfinished. And therefore, when we speak of abolition or abolition democracy, I think of that very much in the spirit of that kind of dialectic of something that is by necessity unfinished, because we are talking about breaking with certain logics that pattern this colonial present or new colonial present. Therefore, we cannot know in advance what will emerge, but we can know that how to get there, basically, by struggling with those kind of, the structural negation of life in ways that then slowly build or make that alternative or bring it into being through practice. And similarly, in thinking about what that alternative might be or mean, whether that could be open borders or what kinds of alliances could actually carry such a project, also politically in that current moment, given that, as you rightfully point out, the kind of internationalism of the 1970s has frayed. And I think of that in conversation very much with Vanessa Thompson, one of our authors, who we were also in conversation with just 2 days ago in Berlin, who kind of pointed out the significance of remembering the project of a political blackness that could be a kind of political rallying ground for various kinds of struggles against, kind of amidst various carceral institutions that are interconnected in the same way that the resistance to those institutions is connected across abolition geographies. So with Ruth Wilson Gilmore, as a kind of internationalism from below that is decentralized, perhaps non-statist, perhaps anti-statist, and yet somehow coheres in ways that continue to actualize this project of abolition as sanctuary. Maybe the last point I will make before I pass the mic to Ananya is that in thinking about sanctuary or beyond sanctuary, we were also in conversation with the legal scholar Itendai Achume, and her important intervention in the article Migration as Decolonization, in which she very carefully articulates just a proposition for how to think about kind of the freedom of movement in a world of nation-state borders and border imperialism. And she doesn't necessarily embrace the idea of open borders, as I think many border abolitionists don't necessarily just advocate for just opening the borders, but keeping everything else intact as is. Rather, she kind of retraces these colonial extractive relationships of dispossession and kind of the wealth hoarding of global north formerly colonizing countries to then reimagine routes of co-sovereignty that would kind of redesign borders, perhaps as permeable, around the kind of de facto political relationships that are still in place that nation-state sovereignty attempts to disarticulate. So by denying the interdependence of countries that were previously colonized to their colonial metropoles, this fiction of the sovereign right to exclude is upheld. This is the right that she refuses to legitimate and instead envisions differently configured kind of regions, perhaps. So I find that inspiring, and think this is the best I can do in responding to both of your really rich sets of comments. And yeah, I will pass the mic to Ananya. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronika, and thank you, Ash and Ida, for really generous, poetic, and I think, and for comments that push this endeavor well beyond the book. Veronika and I were talking about how for us, a book is never the end point of an endeavor, right? It feels like a midpoint. And so I, like Veronika, will think across both sets of comments, and I want to sort of start with Ash's question about, you know, can we think about a just migration system? Is there such a thing? And I'd like to connect that to Ida's question, what does it mean to refuse the law of global apartheid, right? And I think about how if we were to begin to write this book at this point in time, one of the conversations we were having in Berlin just a couple of days ago was that some of the conceptual framework of the book, it's not so much that it's outdated, but the intensification of this racial capitalist conjuncture, right, has taken us beyond even the terminologies of the book, of even what we think is the migration system. And you heralded this also, Veronika, by pointing out the acceleration that we're going to see in Europe. But in the US case, for example, what we're seeing with Trumpism is not, I don't even know if the language of deportation is sufficient to characterize what is going on, because people are no longer going to be sent back to countries of origin. That is irrelevant. They are going to be disappeared precisely through this geography of return hubs and these contracts, if you will, between different authoritarian countries. And so I say this because I think it becomes, in many ways, we want to think about how those fighting for just migration systems, right, are then perhaps reproducing the laws of global apartheid and doing so even under the sign of migrant justice. So yes, we have a critique of liberalism and liberal institutions in the book, but for me, you know, the difficult moment at hand, say in a city like Los Angeles, is that most of our robustly abolitionist movements are now, at the very moment that we're speaking here, fighting sanctuary policies and jurisdictions, right? So they're explicitly fighting sanctuary policies because they see sanctuary policies as deepening this kind of criminalization of migration. And they are explicitly now challenging migrant justice organizations, many of which are committed to the figure of the good immigrant. And sort of the story I've been telling is of how one of our most prominent migrant justice organizations in LA has been refusing to support rent relief and rent strike initiatives for migrant populations, arguing that good immigrants always pay their rent, right? And that if we are to make the case for sanctuary, then we cannot, in fact, have rebellious migrants who engage in such things as rent strikes. I say that because in many ways, I would say that perhaps we cannot make a case for just migration systems, that there is no such thing. And once we let go of that, I think also in Berlin, we were asked to think about whether it is worth rescue as a humanitarian project. And I don't think we can do that, right? So I think we've got to think about what then are the grounds, right, for thinking about, as you put it, Ash, these ways of togetherness. Now, I will say that as we do that, I struggle with sort of the questions of home, right, that you raised, Ida, as much as I struggle with questions of humanism. So we sort of introduced the concept of domicile, which comes from a report from the UN Rapporteur on housing, Balakrishnan Rajagopalan, who's also been very prominent in the third world lawyering movement and is a professor of urban planning at MIT. And we introduced the concept of domicile in the book precisely because we wanted to think about what it means to connect this world in motion to the insistence on the right to return and the right to remain, which is why I also started by having us think about Benito Flores. Because then in many ways, what Benito Flores and our other unhoused comrades in Los Angeles are fighting for is the right to remain. And we see that very much as part of an ethical political demand of a world in motion. And yet, as Michele's brilliant book and writings point out to us, the right to remain and the right to return doesn't come through the defense of home, right? And which is, of course, your work as well. So I think that this question of how we dwell, right, is really crucial. And those radical forms of dwelling, which is beyond inhabitation, not just inhabitation, is I think one of the key questions of the day. In our work in Los Angeles with encampments, with homeless encampments, and the work we've been doing on what we call encampment geographies, we've also been thinking with the writings of Nasser Abrego that if the antonym of mass encampment is inhabitation, well, what is that inhabitation, right? And especially if it doesn't take the form, the domesticity of home. And I think that is the political project at hand. It's not just an intellectual project. And in that political project, I will say that I'm especially interested in this question of rethinking property and land, also, that Ash also raised, right? That our Indigenous studies scholars raise in the book. That what does it mean to think about a way of being that is not settlement, right? That is not the settler relation to land and property. And I will say that in the book, our Indigenous studies scholars, both Kyle Mays and Charles Sepulveda, point us to kinship. And I really struggle with kinship. I struggle with notions of kinship as much as I struggle with notions of home and humanism. And so what does it mean for us to think about queer kinship? In the book, Sarah Haley asks us to think, she's thinking with Saidiya Hartman and asking us to think about errant lives, wayward lives of young Black women, right? That are not about making home per se, and not even about kinship as we would understand it, right? But is a sort of is a radical relationality, and that makes more sense for me. And that to me is also how I read Ronaldo Walcott's work of a freedom beyond humanism. But I will say then that in the book, as Veronika has already pointed out, we hold on to humanism, right? Even though we're deeply ambivalent about Paul Gilroy's, right? About Paul Gilroy's notion of a reparative humanism. And the humanism we turn to, what we hold on to, is a concept from David Scott in David Scott's ongoing conversation with Sylvia Wynter's work, which is the notion of an embattled humanism, right? And that resonates for me in this world of wars everywhere. And that notion of an embattled humanism is one also refused by Black feminists who've been a part of this project, by Saida Hartman, by Tina Kant, absolutely refusing humanism. And I think so I see that refusal as a very productive engagement. And I see embattled humanism as especially generative. And finally, I will say, and so I'm sharing with you all the things I struggle with, because this is precisely the life of a book beyond the book. One of the things that I'm a little worried about now, which we did foreground, is the ways in which the language of fugitivity seems to be everywhere, right? And I know that we're all going to really lean on Ida's work on fugitive care, but I worry when I hear my students constantly post fugitivity as the antonym to global apartheid. And I really hope that our book is not doing that, but I worry that sometimes it gets taken up as that, right? For me, the antonym of racial banishment is not fugitivity. It's abolition, by which I mean abolition as a project, the project of reconstruction, right? And I think that we need effortful and careful work to think about what fugitivity means as a project of political blackness, as an anti-colonial project, as a feminist project, right? So that we are not asking migrants cast out into the world or the unhoused cast out into the world to bear the weight, right, of fugitivity or marronage, or of the work of remaking this world.
Thank you, Ananya.
Into questions.